the wounded from here, there were thousands, 17,000 killed and wounded on the Union side, lesser number on the Confederate side, of course, and they presented an immense challenge. Most of the Union field hospitals were well to the rear. The field hospitals for the fighting that took place in this area were where the Isaac Walton League is today, about 2 miles from here. And of course, there are many vivid stories. Both sides struggled to care for the wounded. The Union wounded eventually would all be evacuated to Fredericksburg. Civilian relief workers came from all over the north to help in Fredericksburg. In May, as 26,000 Union wounded passed through Fredericksburg. The Confederates, the wounded go this way, of course, to Parker's store, to Robinson's Tavern, then back to Orange Courthouse, to the railroad, and on to hospitals in Lynchburg and Richmond and places farther south. Of course, they would leave behind the dead. Now, the armies did not linger here, as you well know. They passed on. There was very little effort to bury the dead, except among, small bodies of men who might have buried a friend or a commanding officer. The percentage of unknowns from this battlefield is very high. From all of our battlefields, is very high. There are 15,000 men buried at the Fredericksburg National Cemetery. Nearly 13,000 of them are unknown. I will say this, though. For those of you who have been to the new exhibit at Chancellorsville, there is a room there in which we list the names of all those we know who died in these battles. It's the only place that I'm aware of that such a list exists related to a single park or battlefield area. Gettysburg has one, I think, done by private people, but ours was done many years ago, and we have listed every man that we know of. It's not like the Vietnam Memorial where we're going to add and correct. It's a graphic representation of 17,600 names of men who died or were mortally wounded on these battlefields. In many ways, it's the part of the exhibit that I'm proudest of because although we have always spoken of unknowns, we feel something as though that at least the men are known now. I think the least that we can do as a nation for the men who give their lives, the least we can do is remember their names. So they may be buried in unknown graves, but they are not unknown any longer. So if you go to Chancellorsville, Union, Confederate, all there on the wall at the Chancellorsville Visitor Center. As for the dead themselves, they would lie here, most of them, unburied until 1865, when an uproar over the condition of dead on many Civil War battlefields was raised, and the federal government made a concerted effort to inter the dead. In June of 1865, they sent a regiment to this part of the world, and that regiment started on the north end of the Wilderness battlefield and worked south. Along the way, they buried hundreds of men, Union and Confederate. Their assignment was only to bury Union dead, but in fact, as they went, they buried Confederate dead as they found them as well. Where they could, they identified them, and on 2 places of the battlefield, they created small cemeteries for these men. And one of those cemeteries stood right in front of you. It was a fenced-in area, white picket fence, about 30 yards square, directly in front of where you're standing now. There were about 560 men buried in this cemetery. Today, there is only a remnant of the cemetery, For in 1866 and 1867, the federal government mounted another effort to create a national cemetery in Fredericksburg. And so they came once again, and they removed the dead, the Union dead only, from these battlefields. 15,000 men buried in the Fredericksburg National Cemetery. The men who were buried here were disinterred from their graves, probably in 1866. Their bodies moved, and all that remains today, if you look very closely, you can see depressions in the ground. Here, a row there, a row there. All through these woods are the depressions of these graves. To me, it's one of the compelling places on any Civil War battlefields, one of the very few places that you can see such evidence, such a tangible scar from the battle itself. So all of these men, when they came here, or most of them at least, knew that their fate may entail a burial, a death like this, an unknown soldier on a nameless piece of ground somewhere. And of course they still came. And of course for all of us, I think, and I mentioned this the other day at our opening ceremony, the great question that we should ask ourselves as we walk these places, and hopefully answer ourselves as well, is why? Why did they consent to this suffering, this effort, this sacrifice? I think the answer to that question is probably why you're all here.